Welcome to the Doghouse. Have a listen as we take a look at life, love, and art in all its forms. Here's your host, the Rock Dog, Andrew Davis.
And the Rock Dog, Andrew Davis. This is the Doghouse. My guest today is Chris Markevich, and he has a brand new podcast out. It's called Left Behind, Socialism in the Age of Right-Wing Populism. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Where are you from?
I'm from Campbell River. I've been living here for about 3.5 years now, originally from Vancouver. I also lived in Ottawa for 3 years and worked on Parliament Hill.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Burnaby as well as Port Moody.
Good childhood?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, there's obviously some struggles that all teenagers go through, but my formative years were not too terrible.
What leads you to this Left Behind podcast? And explain the title, too, Socialism in the Age of Right-Wing Populism.
Okay, well, first of all, as far as why I decided to do this podcast, I've been interested and have been following politics for quite some time now, probably close to 10 or so years actively. And when I was in Ottawa, I was working alongside some colleagues very closely on Parliament Hill as well as in the NDP federal office. And when I came back to BC and saw what was happening in Vancouver specifically, but also in Victoria and up the island with respect to the opioid crisis and the housing crisis, as well as several other things that are issues that are really important to me, I felt it was time to lend my voice to those causes, as well as speak to folks that are very, very close to those individuals that are suffering and are working on the ground as frontline workers, as well as advocates and other folks that might not normally get a voice. When it comes specifically to the name of the podcast, socialism is still a dirty word, not only in this country, but also across the world. We have seen what's been happening with the protests in Chile, the uprisings in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and even in the United States, where Trumpism has effectively taken control. Now, when it comes to right-wing populism, it's no secret that people are feeling disaffected, both with politics as well as politicians themselves. So it's important to remember that when it comes to populism, it's kind of a double-edged sword. There aren't always easy answers, and I think that a lot of politicians are digging into that anger and giving people almost false hope and easy answers and quick fix solutions. And I think that populism in America has started to bleed over into Canada with the election of Doug Ford in Ontario, with the election of Jason Kenney in Alberta, and most recently, just in the last couple of hours, it seems, with Boris Johnson getting a majority in the UK as well. So that's kind of why this podcast is, and other podcasts that focus on left-wing politics are so necessary.
Why do you think there is this rise in populism and nationalism going on right now around the world? It seems like a lot of countries are just really drifting to the right.
Yeah, and again, like I said just a moment ago, people are feeling disaffected and they feel like they can't trust politicians. And right-wing groups are very, very good at messaging, and they're also very good at keeping people afraid, and they mobilize very well. A lot of movements and political organizations on the left have a problem where they tend to fight amongst themselves rather than band together and collectively work on solutions. There seems to be, as far as I understand it anyway, in left-wing politics, this need to be perfect, and it kind of takes away from the overall goal of getting back into power and implementing solutions that would actually help people, whereas the right wing has their collective stuff more or less together, and they're pushing their own agenda, not just in North America or even in the UK, but we've seen it all over Europe as well, with far right parties gaining a lot more traction these days. And further to that, there's been a lot of interference from other bad actors such as Russia and to a lesser extent China and India. But we have to keep in mind that until we can get our messaging consistent, until we can stop fighting amongst ourselves, and until we really tap in to some of the anger and frustrations that everyday folks are living right now, and until we start listening to them, we're not going to win anytime soon.
How can we do that? How can we come together, and how do we stop the fighting? When I talked to Libby Davies, former NDP MP for the downtown east side in Vancouver, and I was asking her kind of the same question. Why is there this constant fighting amongst the left, and why is there such a draw that, and I even heard it today with the Boris Johnson thing, why is there such a draw that says that the left has to be more center?
Yeah, I think that, the third way politics of the 80s and 90s has really kind of pushed back movements of the left for a very long time now. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that up until recently, left or center-left politics has more or less stayed the course as far as keeping the right out of power. Now that that's not working anymore, those same, left or center-left politicians and movements and nonprofit organizations that have benefited from, either labor or liberal governments being in power are now seeing this blowback from more leftist parties and leftist organizations, and they don't want to lose grip on their own power either, because, as the saying goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's true of, progressive organizations as well as, more far-right organizations or even center-right organizations, or what they call free enterprise. So it's important to realize that you have to give a little to get a little. So I'm wondering and I'm hoping that some of these organizations that typically did well in the 80s and 90s will give more space to leftist organizations who can actually counter messaging from the right. And when it's done effectively, and there's room for it, it's done really well and it works. But until that happens, and until some of these more, centrist parties and center-left movements and organizations are willing to give up some of that power, it's not going to change anything. The conversation and the political discourse has already shifted to the right. It's already happened.
Do you believe we can have a center? Do you believe there's middle ground? I know a friend of mine said that to me once. He said we have to come up with some sort of middle ground, but I don't know if can we find middle ground here?
The middle ground, in my opinion, has already been lost. That happened quite a number of years ago in Europe, when some of the far right parties started winning seats, when we started seeing uprisings in countries like Poland and in Georgia, and now we're seeing it even in countries like Sweden and Finland, where refugee crises are giving rise to far-right parties as a reactionary to those crises. And let's be clear, imperialist nations like Britain, like the U.S., like France, when wars are started, when bombing campaigns begin, those are the countries that are primarily affected. Is countries that are from the third world, whether they be resource countries in Africa or in South America, or whether they're in the Middle East. But when this happens, and when far-right parties feed off of those frustrations from people saying that they can't find a job, that they can't find housing, they immediately go to the safe scapegoat, which is to blame refugees and blame immigrants. But being that we've already shifted that conversation, it's kind of a waste of time, in my opinion, to say, well, we need to find some middle ground. The right doesn't care about middle ground. They don't at all. They haven't cared for a very long time. All they want is to get power, and they don't care what they have to do to get it. So, trying to meet them halfway and trying to, shake hands with them, whether it be in a meeting, whether it be in a political arena, is kind of a waste of time. I mean, I'm not saying that we have to, fight them, in the streets all the time, but part of the reason why the left is losing is because we, are constantly apologizing for when someone says something controversial or poses for a photo, like most of the recent example being Joel Harden in Ontario, in Ottawa, posed for a photo with an activist that had a poster that said "fuck Doug Ford."
Yeah.
Right. So, if we're wasting time, with these kinds of minutia, the right is going to keep winning, and they're going to keep pushing the conversation in that direction, because they can sit there and laugh at us as we, splinter away and keep, fighting amongst ourselves as to ideological purity, when we've already missed the boat. So it's time to stop fighting amongst ourselves and to stop pretending that there's a middle ground.
And I think with you brought it up, the opioid crisis. Now, there's some pretty radical ideas out there floating around. A lot of them I agree with. The safe consumption sites were one that was spearheaded by Libby as well. What's your take on that? What would you like to see happen?
Well, as some of my listeners may already know, but some of your listeners probably don't, I'm a former recovering addict myself, and I know some of the struggles with addiction and with the kind of residual and collateral damage that can do. And I have always, even when I wasn't in active addiction, I've always been in favor of safe injection sites, of regulation and decriminalization. I think it should happen in Canada and across the world, to be honest. I mean, although that's kind of a pipe dream at this point. But I think as far as the Canadian context goes, and in fact, in particular in British Columbia, we need to decriminalize all possession. We need to regulate all use of drugs, whether it's pharmaceuticals or otherwise. And we need to support addicts and support families of addicts in getting the resources and the help they need, period. There's no excuse in this country that we have addicts on the street, that we have people dying every day of overdoses. They should be taken care of. We should regulate all those drugs to be used, whether they're to get folks off of drugs with serious addiction or withdrawal problems. It should be done, and it should be done yesterday.
I agree 100%. I would go so far as to complete legalization and to regulate it properly, so people aren't getting heroin that's full with fentanyl and other things that's going to kill them. What do you say to people that they blast back at you and they go, well, they're just junkies anyway, and I got to pay all this money because my kid's a diabetic and I got to pay for his needles, so why are we giving fucking needles to junkies? What do you say to that?
Well, I would say to them that it's entirely wrong that anyone has to pay that much money for insulin either. All drugs should be regulated. They should all be provided to anyone who needs them free of charge, and our tax system should cover it. Our healthcare system should cover it. Whether it's to save someone from dying from an overdose, or whether it's to save someone from dying of ketoacidosis, or from low insulin levels or blood sugar glucose problems, it should be covered. Absolutely, full stop. There's no reason in this country why anyone that needs life-saving drugs shouldn't get them when they need them.
Absolutely. That was pretty much the answer that I like to give to them as well. Also, I was listening to your podcast. You had a great memorial for the Montreal Massacre for the 30th anniversary. I don't want to say anniversary because that's such a shitty term to use for such a shitty thing that happened. But what happened in Montreal 30 years ago, just a few days ago, I know you ran a special on that. You want to touch on that?
Sure. So December 6th, 1989, École Polytechnique, a mass murderer lined up in a college for engineering students. He lined up 14 women, separated them from the men, and basically executed all 14 of them in the classroom. And then, of course, when everyone started running and trying to get away, he shot and wounded dozens of others. And he did it because he hated feminists. He specifically said in his manifesto, when he spoke, in front of all of the people that were in that classroom, that he wanted to kill all feminists. So the special that I did for my podcast, I interviewed Julie Lalonde, who's an educator and an advocate for women's rights, as well as for ending violence against women and sexual violence in Canada. And we talked about some of the issues in the last 30 years that have either not abated and or gotten worse in this country. One of them, of course, being sexual assault. And one of the infographics I shared on my blog post was out of all of the sexual assaults per year that happen in Canada, for every 1,000 that are reported, for every 1,000 that occur in Canada, only 33 of them are reported, and only 3 out of 1,000 go to a conviction in this country.
Wow.
And, beyond that, there's also a serious issue with stalking, as well as revenge porn. For folks that don't know what that is, revenge porn is basically when either an ex-partner or someone very close to the victim will take either nude photos or doctored or altered photos of the victim and share them with pornographic websites, and will often use them as blackmail to get something from the victim in return for taking the photos down. And in most cases, as it's usually prevalent in most sexual violence cases, those photos aren't taken down. They're either shared even more so, or other things will come up even after the fact. And a lot of women in these cases will either lose their jobs and or be ousted from educational institutions that they may be going to, simply because either A, they have those photos of themselves, or B, their reputation may be ruined. So it's a very, very serious thing. And stalking was another thing that we spoke about, which is actually a very personal issue to Julie. I won't really get into much about her story personally. You can go to outsideoftheshadows.ca if you want to watch a video, a PSA that she made on her experience. There's also multiple articles online that you can look at that talk about her experience. But the only thing I will say is that after 10 plus years of being stalked by her partner and her partner passing away due to a car accident, she was finally able to tell her story. And part of the issue with stalking in particular is that the more you talk about it, the worse it gets. Because that's what a lot of perpetrators want, is that they want the notoriety, they want the attention. And so, 30 years after the École Polytechnique massacre, have we really learned anything as a country from, this, horrific incident where, someone wants to kill women simply because they're women? And I'm not sure that we have.
I'm not sure we have either, especially with the so-called incels that are out there all the time. These men that figure that, they can get whatever they want, and if they don't get it, then, yeah, we know what happens, right? Also,
Right.
Another thing that you touched on in one of your podcasts is the LGBTQ community, and basically this bill that was going to be introduced. Was it in Alberta?
That's correct. Yeah, it was Bill 207, and it was a conscience rights bill put forward by, I can't recall his name right now, but an MLA in the governing party. He's a backbencher MLA, but is widely known in Alberta to be anti-choice. He attends those March for Life rallies that are anti-abortion. And this particular bill would have given physicians the rights by law to not only refuse treatment to folks seeking abortion or gender-affirming surgeries or prescriptions and medications, but would also give them the right to refuse referral, which is currently required by provincial law.
And so part of the post I did on that was I interviewed a physician by the name of Gillian Ratty. She is a member of the Alberta Medical Services Association. I may be getting the exact name of it wrong, but it's basically a body of physicians in Alberta
that spoke out vociferously against this bill. And when I interviewed her, she was preparing to go into committee to speak to the Alberta legislature about this bill. And you can actually find on the Alberta website the committee hearing for that. If you just, I believe if you just go to their website, alberta.ca, and type in Bill 207 committee, you should be able to find it. But ultimately, that same night after I interviewed her, the bill was actually voted down in committee. 4 of the governing party UCP MLAs actually voted against their own bill, citing issues around overreach of the bill, being that conscience rights was already enshrined in law, and physicians already had the power to refuse services. They were just required to make a referral to someone else. And even in their own statements, they said that this bill went too far. So it's not over yet. There's still going to be the possibility that a similar bill like this will get resurrected in the spring sitting. It might also come back in its original form for debate again, because even notwithstanding the fact that the committee at the time turned it down, there's nothing to stop the governing party from shuffling that committee, taking those MLAs out and putting some other MLAs in its place, and then ramming it through with final votes in the legislature. So the fight is not over.
The fight doesn't seem to ever be over. That's a common phrase I still hear. I asked somebody this once on one of my podcasts. I'm going to ask you as well. Do you consider yourself a social justice warrior?
Well, that depends on your interpretation of what social justice warrior is. I know that SJW as an acronym is used quite often as a pejorative, especially on Twitter and Facebook. And I actually wear that badge proudly. I don't care what anyone thinks of what a social justice warrior is or isn't. I define it for myself. Same thing with calling myself a feminist. Same thing with calling myself an activist. I wear those badges proudly because I know to myself what they mean. If it means, to me that I'm standing up for, human rights, if I'm standing up for feminism, if I'm standing up for, folks that are homeless or addicts or any of those issues that are important to me as a human being, then yes, I will call myself that. And I will not hesitate to, use my voice to, further, assisting people who need it. And if that's what being a social justice warrior is, then so be it. I'll wear that.
I will wear the badge as well, my friend. I think so. I kind of like it because I think it pisses people off, and well, I like to do that as well.
Yeah, I don't really shy away from ruffling feathers. Just to give you a bit of background, back in the 2015 election, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a hashtag that went viral on social media, CPC Jesus, I believe it was called. And it started when a Vancouver area MP, I think her name was Mai Young, or Y Young. She was attending a Christian service of some kind. It might have been a fundraiser or another town hall meeting. I can't recall exactly what the circumstances were, but she basically said that Stephen Harper's re-election was ordained by Jesus. Or something along those lines. Yeah. So that hashtag started trending, and I took it upon myself to find some very quotable passages from the Bible, and I inserted either the Harper's name or the Conservative Party's name into some of those passages, and started tweeting those out with that hashtag. And at the time, I was volunteering for the NDP, during the election, and I still had on my profile, on Twitter, that I was this database administrator or whatever you wanted to call it, or as a database worker, right? Because I did have a job with the party up until the federal election was called, and then, as everyone knows, when the election gets called, all the jobs get shelved, so you can go volunteer, right? Because you can't, by law, pay someone to work for your party or for the in the House of Commons during the election. It's illegal. You can't do that. So everyone gets their jobs laid off, and you go volunteer. So that's what I was doing. But the Rebel actually picked up on my profile and ran a story and included me in it. And they said that a database admin working in the NDP's war room was even tweeting out all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't work in the war room, so you got nothing on me.
That's fear from them.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. I mean, some of my tweets made, the Huffington Post, CTV News. It was pretty hilarious. But, that's kind of, why I don't mind being dubbed either a social justice worker or warrior, rather, or any of those other terms that reactionaries, from the right like to append. Or another one I like to hear a lot is, those libtard or snowflake or any of those kind of labels. And the funny thing is that it seems to me that the far right activists who use those terms are the most reactionary and have the kind of the weakest egos of all, and they can't take any criticism. They can dish it out, but they can't take it.
Much like the orange one himself, he can't take it, but he can dish it out.
Exactly.
What's the next big issue? What do you got your sights on? What do you want to shine a light on?
Well, I actually have a poll up right now on my Patreon page, asking what my second episode should be on, and a couple things I've already mentioned that I want to talk about on my podcast, being homelessness, the housing crisis in British Columbia, the opioid crisis, but a couple of other things that I'm looking to talk about in the first couple episodes. There's a new political party in British Columbia, the BC Eco-Socialists. I've been corresponding with them over the last couple of weeks, and I'll be interviewing them fairly soon. So I want to talk about new political parties. I want to talk about, grassroots political movements, especially ones that don't get a lot of attention in British Columbia, in Canada, and around the world as well. And I also want to talk about some of the issues that, although they get a lot of airtime, they typically only talk to experts in the field. They don't always talk to folks that are living those experiences. So I want to dig a little bit deeper than just, when you get numbers from nonprofit organizations that say, 40% of X population is suffering from Y, or 20% of people polled in this issue say that blank is the most pressing issue in the next election. I don't want to keep things on the surface. I want to get under that surface and find out what's really going on.
Where can people find you?
You can find me on my podcast website, leftbehindpodcast.com. You can also follow along on Facebook, facebook.com/Left Behind Socialism Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at @the_LB podcast. And I also have an Instagram page, which is at Left Behind Socialism Podcast. And for my personal account that I also tweet from, you can follow me at Chris_Markevich.
Thanks a lot for coming in, or for talking to me today and telling me what you're up to. It's like your podcast sounds great. You're doing a fantastic job, and I think you're going to do well.
Thank you very much. And I also like to congratulate you on your recent endeavors to further your education. I think that is super important as well, and another issue that doesn't get talked about enough in British Columbia and Canada and just in general in the world on how important education really is.
I agree. Actually, I would like, tuition freeze, or maybe tuition to be free. I mean, I could have already, after being let go from my job, I could have already been retrained and out on the street, so to speak. Well, thank you much for talking to me. I'd love to come on your show one time if you want me on.
Absolutely. It would be a pleasure to have you on.
You've been listening to The Doghouse with Andrew Davis.